Who gets to be awesome in games?
Many games come with the promise of letting the player live out some kind of awesome, aspirational fantasy. Maybe that's to become a comic book superhero. Perhaps it's the opportunity to wield a lightsaber, or become the member of a secretive assassin's guild, to be a rock god, a samurai, a rally car driver, or a no-nonsense yakuza. And from my experience of playing this sort of game, it feels like there's two distinctly different ways of delivering this fantasy. The first way is to simply give the fantasy to the player, easily and immediately, which is something we see in a number of recent superhero games. In the Batman Arkham games, the free-flow combat system makes it effortless to beat up baddies.
Oh, this game was awesome. I love the movement system and like the combat system in the game. Like when I was first learning it, I thought it was awesome that you could like use all the little Batman gadgets, like, and there's like 10, 15, 20 enemies like doing like the little, what was it, Kumite style like fight. Like they're all like swarming around you, but yet no one's making a move yet or whatever. It wasn't until that like I learned how to exploit the system when you can just like do a move and then jump, do a move and then jump, do a move and then jump, that it got a little like corny to me. Like as long as Batman is jumping, he can't die.
And in Spider-Man, we don't need a lengthy tutorial to swing around the city with ease and grace. This is usually achieved by providing the sensation of being powerful, which happens through simple inputs that get translated into big, flashy animations, cinematic set pieces with pop-up buttons, lenient systems that subtly fix your mistakes, magnetic snapping towards enemies, big, obvious indicators that tell you when to counter, dopey AI that waits patiently to attack, and so on. These games work really hard to make you feel awesome by translating your simple intentions into impressive feats on screen. Troy Skinner, producer at Batman publisher WB Games, explains it like this.
When people come in, they spam the punch in the face button. A lot of games you get punished for that. That makes you look bad. You fail.
Dang.
In this game, you spam the punch in the face button and you look awesome. You are in fact Batman, effectively punching people in the face.
That's really cool. Not gonna lie.
The second way is to make the player earn the fantasy through skill and mastery, which is the approach of this year's Doom Eternal. That game has a very stiff learning curve, with all sorts of mechanics and systems to figure out.
Another video on Doom Eternal. Woo!
Including resource management, enemy weak points, weapon switching, lightning fast movement, the flame belch, the chainsaw, the blood punch, and more. And until you master all of them, you're going to fail, and you certainly won't feel like the badass demon slayer in the game's marketing, which means that the opportunity to live out the power fantasy is withheld until you've proven that you have real skill and mastery over a complex set of mechanics.
Real skill. Not the fake skill, the real skill.
Hugo Martin is the creative director on Doom Eternal and explains it like so.
Hey man, I'm dying to these characters because I'm not, doing certain things. I don't feel strong. It's like, yeah, but you're gonna feel strong when you master how to beat them.
Mm-hmm.
So we can give the fantasy to the player, or we can make them earn it.
Both of these options, depending on the game, are completely viable. It just depends on what kind of game you want to make as a developer and what kind of game you want to play as a player. It's not like one is right and wrong. It's just different flavors of ice cream, essentially.
But why would a developer choose one over the other? Well,
money.
Well, Hugo Martin puts it very succinctly when he says,
we want to give you something to master, because the power fantasy that is earned is far more satisfying than the one that is just handed to you.
Dang, him laying it out like that. It feels better to earn the power than it is to been given the power. That's a hard statement, my man.
By making the player actually overcome challenge, failure, and frustration, the end result will be way more rewarding. He compares the experience of mastering Doom Eternal to that of climbing a mountain. It's much more satisfying, he says, to climb it yourself than to simply take an elevator to the top.
This is true, but also this is like a very absolute statement, but there is like a gradient to this statement. Like how much do we want the player to earn in terms of skill versus how much do we just want to give them the fantasy. It's not like a 100% like absolute this or that. It's more like a gradient or like a slider, I would say.
The top. It's a fair point, and many of these superhero games do end up feeling shallow and patronizing because they give the fantasy away too easily. But when designers tie the attainment of a power fantasy to a certain level of skill, they ultimately end up having to ask who gets to live out the fantasy and who gets left behind. As Troy Skinner explains,
because we are expert gamers, we say that mastery should come from overcoming challenge. You earn it.
Again, it's another hard statement that, when these guys are talking about this, it's like, I don't know what they have like made or whatever. I don't know Troy Skinner or whatever, like what he's made. Maybe he made like the Batman games or whatever. Like both people that say you should earn the fantasy versus getting handed the fantasy to you, both of them in their minds, they are thinking that they are doing the correct thing for that game, for that player base, for that target audience. So again, this is not like a what's right, what's wrong thing. It's just how much sliding of it there is.
But remember, everyone paid $60, and the majority of them aren't going to push through those barriers to get to the mastery. And mastery is tied to motivation. So if they're not masterful, they're demotivated, they walk away.
He argues that there are plenty of players who simply...
I think because of that statement, there's been a lot of... There's like the mechanic of difficulty in games versus no difficulty, a lot of games, like especially in Doom Eternal, there's a difficulty selector thing or whatever. You get like super easy, and then at the very bottom there's like ultra nightmare. But if you look at like the Souls like games or whatever, there is no difficulty slider. It's just the game. And both the types of games, like the difficulty slider one and the no difficulty slider, both of them can be rewarding to a specific audience. It's just, what do you want to get out of the game when like you pick up a copy of whatever? What do you want? There is no right or wrong answer, really.
Aren't willing to suffer through failure and frustration in order to experience the game's core fantasy. For example, Troy points to the bro gamer, casual players who have a very low threshold for suffering and want to feel competent immediately.
Also, he used a clip. I just want to point this out. He used a clip of a controller player, all right, lying on the bed with his sneakers on. This guy's a clown, all right? I'm going to say it. This guy's a clown.
And because they make up 60% of the console market, you ignore them at a cost. More importantly, however, there are players who simply aren't able to reach that level. In the book Glued to Games, behavioural scientist Scott Rigby talks about control mastery, which is the time and energy needed to learn a game's inputs and be able to turn intention into action. He compares this to paying for admission to get into a theme park. Both are necessary steps in order to access the actual fun inside. But, Scott says, when people are discouraged by a game's controls, they don't have the chance to feel competent at gameplay because they can't even get to the real game.
I can feel that statement being true for like certain fighting games. Like, wasn't it like Guilty Gear or whatever? Like the combos in Guilty Gear are massive or whatever because they use like the quarter circle, half circle, like the Shoryu movements or whatever, comboed with like just gigantic, just huge combos or whatever. And that alone will keep a lot of the casual players out of that game market because it's like a high skill ceiling, a high skill expression versus something, seemingly as basic as Super Smash Brothers Melee. You have your A attack, your B, your special, and what was it? You could have like your tilts, your aerials, and that's it. At like the simplest form, that's That's Melee. It isn't until like you start to like the game and start wanting to get better that it like turns into like one big jumbled mess of like wave dashing and shining and all this other complicated shit.
For them, the price of admission to the fun of games is so high, they often stay outside the turnstile. And that's not even mentioning those with disabilities who may be physically unable to reach that level of skill.
Yeah.
Shouldn't they get to experience the power fantasy too?
Yeah.
Ultimately then, we end up with a conundrum. If we make the power fantasy easily attainable, the game is accessible to all but can end up feeling shallow to more seasoned players. And if we force the player to earn the fantasy, the experience might be significantly more satisfying, but we lock out a considerable number of people.
Yes. But one game doesn't have to encapsulate every aspect of earn the fantasy versus give the fantasy. One game doesn't have to like incorporate both. You can have like gateway games, like games that are like easy, you know, like Batman or whatever, or Spider-Man, to get someone like get their foot in the door of liking games. And you know, once they like games, it's like, ooh, I like this type of game. Maybe I kind of want to play something harder. And then you start looking up, ooh, what are the harder games that everyone's playing? Ooh, the Souls-like games, ooh, Doom Eternal, so on and so forth. You know, that's how that little evolution happens. So it's not like one game has to get both, is what I'm trying to say.
By making one type of player feel awesome, we lose the other. But maybe it doesn't have to be a choice. And so, I'm going to explore a number of ways that games can make both types of player feel awesome.
Mm-hmm.
The first solution is to provide options, but not the type
like
you might be
options.
thinking about. Because yes, difficulty options will allow players to tune the game to their ability level,
Yep.
but they rarely fix the actual issue, the inherent complexity of the game. Making Doom Eternal easier will let you make a few more mistakes, but it doesn't reduce the number of buttons you need to remember. And making Spider-Man harder doesn't actually change the web swinging at all. So more important are gameplay and accessibility options. And for a strong example, take Forza Horizon 4. Here, you can enable things like assisted brakes and steering, automated gear shifting, and a racing line. With these options turned on, the game helps players reach the fantasy of being a racing driver by reducing the need for precision, limiting the number of things you need to juggle, and providing lots of information.
I think this is completely fine in games for games to do this. Like even in fighting games, what was it? In like even in Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 or whatever, it's like you had normal mode and then you had simple mode to do like combos or whatever. In like normal mode, it's like it's normal. You know, you got light, medium, heavy, launch, or not launch, fucking special, and then you had like your two little extra buttons or whatever. And that's the game. But when you put on simple controls, you could essentially just spam any button like over and over again and do like moderately well. All right. That's that mode. You know, you're showing your mom how to like play the game. All right. That's essentially what you're doing. You're showing like a first time gamer to like, you're putting on that mode for that type of person. All right. Your mom's not going to like it when you try to show her Halo and then she ends up looking straight up in the air and like just spinning around and she doesn't know how to like get her crosshair back down. She's like throwing grenades up on like into straight in the air and then just land up on herself. And she ends up killing herself. All right. No, you can't do that. You got to put it on simple. All right.
With these options, you can essentially switch the game from being a rather hardcore simulation racer to a fun and casual arcade romp. And best of all, this is all independent from the difficulty level of your rival racers. So you can reduce the complexity of controlling the car, but without also dumbing down the competition. Other examples of gameplay options include the automatic combo mode in Devil May Cry,
Yeah.
the way Jedi Fallen Order makes parry timing windows bigger on easy mode, and how some of the Arkham games let you turn off those counter indicators so you have to pay attention to the enemy animations. A second solution is to reward mastery, but not actually require it. For this one, let's look at Bayonetta. This is a game where you almost immediately feel empowered and awesome, thanks to great animation, absurd finishing moves, a very forgiving dodge, and a reasonably low level of challenge. You can basically just mash the controller against your face, and Bayonetta will pull off a huge variety of awesome looking attacks. It's easy to feel fluid, cool, and competent in this game. But there's so much hidden mastery in this game for those who are willing to put in the work. Things like the dodge offset system and the huge number of possible moves means that those who want to get combo mad can express their skill and mastery. That ends up being the real power fantasy, which is indeed more satisfying because it's earned. If we think about this by borrowing terms from esports,
ooh, Titanfall 2 even. Oh baby.
There's skill floor, which describes the baseline level of skill needed to be effective with that character, and skill ceiling, which describes the highest level of skill you can potentially express. If Spider-Man has a low skill floor but a low skill ceiling, and Doom Eternal has a high skill ceiling but a high skill floor to match, something like Bayonetta strikes a better balance by having a low skill floor and a high skill ceiling.
Ooh.
Solution 3 is to layer.
I think that's like very similar to what do you call it? Super Smash Melee. Low skill floor, high skill ceiling, you know? Easy to learn, hard to master. You cannot go wrong with that statement.
On complexity over time. In a lot of Metroidvanias, such as the Ori games, you start the game with a very simple set of controls. You can really just focus on movement and jumping, so players who are unfamiliar with platformers only need to wrestle with the absolute basics at this point. As you play on, the game gives you upgrades like additional jumps, new attacks, more complex moves, and so on. By the end of the game, Ori has become a complex game with a huge moveset, but without overwhelming anyone in the process. By stretching the learning curve out to encompass pretty much the entire game, players can gradually get used to more and more complex gameplay. We do see some of this in Doom Eternal, with weapons and enemy types being introduced throughout the campaign. And in Spider-Man, where the skill tree lets you add new mechanics that let you swing faster, but also increase the complexity of the controls. Solution 4 is to simply prime players for failure and learning through the narrative and marketing. One of the issues with Doom Eternal is that the game suggests that you are the most powerful demon-slaying badass in the universe. I mean, you just ripped your way through hell in the previous game, and now you're falling at the feet of the game's most basic demons? Ultimately, when games promise to let you play as Batman or Spider-Man or the Dragon of Dojima or the God of War, it's priming us to be powerful and skillful. And so it does make sense that we immediately get to feel awesome. Anything else would just be discordant. And so if a game wants to make us earn the fantasy, it needs to explain that up front. A good example of this is Skate, a skateboard simulation game with a significant learning curve just to do a kickflip.
Skate was awesome. I remember playing this game when it first came out, and the controls for this game were like so unique. I was just like me and my boys were just like having so much fun on this game. Like essentially, you know, you're just flicking the stick every which way or whatever, and it was just cool. We would just like take turns passing the controller, like doing little like missions or whatever, and it was awesome.
But it doesn't suggest that you'll immediately start playing as a pro skater. Instead, you're just a lowly amateur trying to get their photo on the 37th page of a magazine. The game's narrative, which is about slowly becoming more successful as a skater, neatly mirrors the game's challenging learning curve. And finally, Solution 5 is to provide multiple ways to win. I've been playing a lot of Hades lately, and in each run of this mythological roguelite, you pick a weapon, perhaps a sword or maybe a bow and arrow. Some of these weapons are far easier to use than others. The shield, for example, lets you absorb enemy attacks and play in a very defensive and reactionary manner, whereas the fists force you to get up close and personal with your enemies, which puts you at a significant risk. By having different ways to succeed, players can gravitate towards the weapon, the character, or the build that works for them. Hades also lets you unlock additional power, health, and help, so it's possible to succeed not by getting better, but by simply playing the game for a long time. That's not my personal preference for how roguelikes should work, but I can see the advantage in giving players a different way to succeed, through time and effort, rather than skill and mastery.
Yeah, that's a big contention point right there. Do you want to reward skill, or do you want to reward a time investment? You know, if if you're like a younger person, you probably want to get rewarded for your skill. And if you're an older person playing games, it's like you feel like, oh, I put the time in. I've been cutting down like 10,000 trees. I can finally be able to cut down to blue one, you know? It's like, yeah, but there was no skill, like skill gain in there or whatever. You cut down 10,000 trees just so you can cut down to blue one. Who gives a shit? Meanwhile, it's like I put time and effort into like figuring out how to aim or whatever. I did like a 1080 quick no scope fucking whatever, and it's like, oh baby, that's some skill right there.
Most of these solutions are about the same exact thing, letting players find their own way to feel powerful. That might mean using accessibility options and tuning down the difficulty, or it might mean ramping the game up to hard, playing with the most challenging character, and exploring the game's most complex rules. Both of those might be the optimum challenge for two completely different people. And something else that a lot of these solutions have in common is that they encourage players to always be pushing themselves to be better, to be moving towards more challenging and complex gameplay. In Forza, using those assist options reduces the amount of XP you gain, so you're encouraged to eventually turn them off as you get better at the game. In Bayonetta, scrappy play leads to rubbish trophies, so you're motivated to be more thoughtful with your actions. In Hades, there's rewards for trying out weapons you haven't used in a while, and in Ori, the game just naturally gets more complex the further you go. Because the power fantasy, it turns out, is not one specific point on the learning curve. It's something more dynamic that can move and grow as you do. You might feel the power fantasy immediately, and then feel it even more strongly as you challenge yourself to do better, to explore more of the game's systems, and to increase the challenge of the game. So ultimately, if the question is who gets to be powerful, my answer would be everyone. Not just those who are skillful, and not just those who want to feel immediate empowerment, but games should use design and systems to ensure that at every skill level, the player feels powerful and masterful, but always with room to grow and improve.
And I think that's the best case scenario that a game could possibly go for in its audience.
Hey, don't click away just yet. I know YouTube end screens are boring, I've seen the stats, so I'm gonna make them more interesting by using this time to recommend a different game at the end of each video. These will be recently released indie games and entirely based on my own preferences, so it's definitely not an ad spot. Are you ready? Because I only get 20 seconds to do this. Let's go. Disc Room is a juicy arcade romp about dodging a bullet hell spread of deadly saw blades. The masterstroke is the way it entices you to keep playing with bite-sized goals and challenges, surprising abilities, and best of all, Fez-like puzzles and mysteries. It's out now on Steam and Switch.
Nice. Bro, I thought this is a great video. 100%. The whole fantasy is given versus fantasy is earned. You know, that's a debate that's going to go on for, you know, like in single player games, you know, it's nice to have a little bit of both or whatever. And especially in like speed running communities for like a single player game, it falls more along the line of like earned fantasy or whatever. But at that point, you're speed running the game and it's like not even a fantasy anymore. Like you're just gunning it to gun it. I think that's fine in single player games, like story driven games, but then when it comes to multiplayer games, it's different. You know, what does the game want to set out to do in its multiplayer competitive aspect? That's a good question. But yeah, I mean, essentially everybody should be able to be awesome as long as they put the time and the effort into it, you know. It is what it is, man. But, you know, overall, I thought it was a good video. I want to see more. And I'll see you guys in the next one. All right? See ya.